Welcome to Belonging Reimagined. I'm your host, Dr. Mona. As a mental health therapist, professor, and researcher, I guide folks in owning their belonging journey and exploring barriers to belonging. In this podcast, I explore real stories with phenomenal guests about how to experience both interconnection and interdependence. And my hope for you is that you learn ways to experience more connection in the world around you and the world within yourself. We don't have to do this life thing alone. You're right where you belong. We have on the show today Lindley Cherry, who I met earlier this year at a phenomenal conference in Norway, which many of you have seen pictures on social or heard me refer to. And it really was a life-changing experience that I went on. And one of the things that has forever changed my life was having met you specifically, Lindley, who was one of the organizers of this trip, where you brought therapists together from really all different parts of the world, mostly from the US, who came together to learn about neurodivergence training and learning how to conduct ADHD and autism assessments. And for any of you who've been following this show, you know that I was more recently diagnosed with autism and ADHD. And so I'm an ADHDer is what we call ourselves, or what I call myself at least. And that is because of having really been more deeply introduced to neurodivergence beyond just kind of the basics that I knew. Even within the mental health field, I knew kind of basic stuff, but that is because of the expertise and knowledge of today's guest, Lindley Cherry. So I'm so happy to have you, and so deeply honored that in your very busy schedule that you would agree to come and join us, and forever grateful, like I said, Lindley, for the way that you've changed my life in helping me get the diagnoses that I needed to help name a lot of the experiences that I've had, where I felt just weird and different and not like other people. And knowing that something felt what I would call at the time off, knowing now that it's not off, it's just what on looks like for me. Maybe it doesn't go in step with maybe a lot of, what we would say neurotypical people, but certainly aligns with my neurodiverse friends and family and loved ones. And so I thank you for being here. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. And for sharing all those wonderful things. I truly appreciate that.
Well, you have your own journey with ADHD specifically. Mm-hmm. So, neurodivergence is a really umbrella term, right? That it includes so many different types of ways that our brains might think differently than a neurotypical brain. And we're going to focus today specifically on ADHD, which is something that has become almost like beyond the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders. Boo on the word disorders, by the way. Beyond that, it's almost become like a pop culture term, like, oh, that's my ADHD, right? And so I would love to hear, and this is actually something I don't know, and so I'm asking you genuinely, I would love to hear from you, Lindley, about your journey to having this really special interest in ADHD.
Yeah. So I was diagnosed with ADHD very young. I don't remember it. I know I had been tested again, like in college, and I was like, no, I'm fine. And I was not. And so always having that was something I know initially I assumed, oh, that's how everyone else is. If you have ADHD or any type of neurodivergence, which I didn't even know what that was, of course, no, you know what that is. Like they caught it, they talked about it, right? And as I got into my graduate program for counseling, I applied for a PhD program, got in, and started doing research on, you find the gaps, right? They say, where are the gaps in the therapy world that we need to research? And one of the big things that I happened to accidentally stumble upon was when I was actually doing I was TAing for an assessment course, and nobody talked about ADHD. Nobody was talking about autism. Nobody was talking about anything other than anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
That's how, in the diagnostic classes and all of it. In our clinical courses, in practicum, none of it was ever past those what I've heard people.
The standard things for ADHD.
the standard things for mental
for
health.
mental health.
Like anxiety, as you know, because everyone's got anxiety and depression, and that's just how it was framed when I was learning about it, and it just seemed not quite right. And so, as I got into my PhD program, started studying, I started looking up who could assess for ADHD and autism, and autism really kind of came into my world more predominantly in that of adults, with some people I had in my cohort who were very passionate about that. And so we were talking and I was like, I have ADHD. And they were like, okay, like, how do you know? And I was like, well, I just was told I do. And so you start really looking into, wait, how? Because I'm not bouncing off the walls.
Right.
I am able to hold a conversation where I don't interrupt, or where I don't do all of these, pieces that the DSM, calls a deficit or an issue for other people. I have friends, yes, sometimes I forget to text them back or things like that, but it wasn't something that I was super aware of in like as an adult, and how I had changed and how I had grown. Yeah. And that conversation just sparked everything.
Yeah.
Because I was like, well, how do you know you have autism? You're not a child. And they were like, exactly. That's the thing. And so we started collaborating and started researching. And long story short, it turned into one of my just deep dive ADHD traits of, this is my new thing and I am here for it. And there was nothing. There was no information about, okay, why aren't we teaching this? And there was no information. No one could answer me when I said, can't we assess for this? We're licensed and it's part of the DSM. No, you can't. Why not? Nobody could answer me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the amount of research I found on adult specific traits, and I say traits rather than symptoms, it's not an illness. It's not something that comes and goes. It is you're born with it, you're going to die with it.
Right.
And so I call them traits because it's just part of me and it's not something I can change. Yeah. And I'm finally not ashamed of that. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it went from there to, I want answers. Why can't you give them to me? I don't know isn't one.
And the barrier was actually getting an assessment. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Getting an assessment by someone who saw me for who I was now as an adult.
Yeah. Right.
And not the very, young child symptoms, traits that people are looking for. Mm-hmm. And how could you have ADHD? This is another piece. How could you have this, but you're so successful? Look at you. You're in a PhD program. You're so smart, though. What does that have to do with anything?
And it's interesting, right? Because I've had people more recently, when I've told them that I'm autistic and ADHD, they're like, wow, and look at it. It's not even stopping you. And I'm like, actually, it's what's driving me. It's the complete opposite. Mm-hmm. Like being autistic and being ADHD, but we'll focus on the ADHD. I'm a hyperactive type, as we later discovered. And that is what keeps me kind of moving and going and interested in more things, mm-hmm. and saying, wait, yes. I'm impatient about that thing over there because I'd rather be spending my time doing this thing over here. It's like a sorting mm-hmm. tool for me. And I find that having ADHD actually, because for me, the way it presents is the impatience. I don't have the inattentive type, although I definitely have some aspects of that. But it actually keeps me locked into what I would call some kind of purpose or life path, because I really don't have the patience to be doing shit that just doesn't align. And so much of that is the ADHD for me. Yep. And so I have found it to be this tremendous gift, but only mm-hmm. because of being able to do several things, surround myself with people, first of all, that get it and are really supportive. And that's not something that all of us have. So I'm hoping that in this podcast, we can shed some light on some kind of misconceptions about ADHD, just like what you're saying right now and what we're sharing. But also the other thing has been like my ability to embrace these traits that I have. So first of all, name them, to be able to see them. And it goes along with what you're saying. Like I couldn't even fully self-belong, right? I couldn't belong fully to myself because I couldn't see and put a name to what was going on with me with these traits, like naming these traits. It was like it would get pathologized into some kind of personality thing that I had going on. Like I'm impatient.
Yep.
You know, it's like these personality characteristics or quirks. Like, oh, I'm just an impatient person. It's like, I'm not an impatient person overall. My nervous system gets impatient with certain things that are happening and certain kinds of stimuli because I'm always on go. So like just standing still, I feel like I'm going to jump out of my skin, not because I'm an impatient person, but because neurodevelopmentally there's something happening in my nervous system, right? That standing still feels exhausting, as opposed to like walking faster when I can on the days that I can. So whenever I was able to name those things, you know, with the support of people like you, who are able to help us understand deeper what ADHD is, then I felt like I could belong back to myself more and that I could embrace these traits in ways of like what I'm talking about of like, oh, this is actually not something that's a barrier that I'm overcoming, but something that actually is a motivator and support, like a vehicle that I ride in more smoothly now that I've gotten into that car. And also be able to celebrate those traits more. So for me, the process of getting an assessment, getting a proper diagnosis has increased my sense of belonging within myself, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For me, the process of creating this assessment and working with other individuals, working with adults who come in and who have that exact same whoa. And you see this shock, but relief.
Yeah.
I experience that constantly. But like doing that really helped me feel like I belong to in my own body too, because it was such a shameful thing before. You know, oh, that's my ADHD. Don't tell anybody. Don't show it. Don't, you know, do everything you can to hide it. You know, go work on these papers in the office at 3 a.m. when the security guard has already left. So people don't know how long it takes you to do something. If, you know, you have all of these thoughts, don't share those. Be quiet.
Yeah. Yeah. So feeling like you have to live in the shadows. And I want to go back to what you just said. You said you touched on creating an assessment. You did something really incredible that I've not seen done around ADHD and autism as well. You actually created your own assessment to evaluate and decide and help, you know, diagnose folks with ADHD, autism. What led to your doing that?
When I was doing my research and I found there's so much out there, evidence-based research, a long history of it, truly, of here is the difference between ADHD in adults and children. And I was like, why are none of these anywhere? Why have I never heard of these? Why are these things we aren't talking about? And it made me realize that it's just because it doesn't exist. At least that I had ever
found. An
found.
Assessment for adults?
Yes, even though we have the information. And it was something I could not wrap my mind around. And it made me so angry because it seemed so simple and so straightforward. But it wasn't out there.
So they were taking assessments that were used on children and then giving those to adults. Give an example of how, like, of maybe something on one of these assessments that would apply possibly to a child, but not to an adult.
Sitting or not being able to sit still in class. When you are in a work meeting, when you are sitting at the table dinner, sitting on your legs, like crossing your legs, touching your feet, that is how adults typically will, that restlessness they may feel, they do that because getting up and walking away or just jumping up isn't socially acceptable or isn't a thing you can do because you could lose your job if you do that in the middle of a meeting.
Right. There's more consequence.
And we have had the time to figure that out, where a child hasn't. You aren't going to kick them out of kindergarten because they got out of their seat.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that you've taught us, because you came, by the way, Lindley came and trained our entire practice of like 40 some folks who were in attendance for 10 weeks. I mean, these folks were wanting to make sure that they showed up to these trainings because they were so rich and so great. But one of the things that you had taught us is to ask, what are you doing to stay seated?
Mm-hmm. How did you get there?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. And when I now give these assessments to folks and the way that you've trained us to do, they're like, oh, I never thought about it. I'm like, do you sit on your hands? Do you sit on your feet? Yep. What is it that you're having to do to stay focused? And I mean, I get all sorts of answers that come up from folks, and it's been really, really interesting. So that's an example then of how someone as an adult could answer, no, they're not getting up from their seat, and then not get diagnosed properly, and then not get the support, and then still live in the shadows, possibly with the shame, and think, then what is it that's going on with me? Then not being able to name that thing, then not feeling that stronger sense of belonging within themselves. Mm-hmm. It's like a domino effect.
I think another good example of that is a lot of with psychological testing, they will do a reaction time test where it's like a little gray screen and they have like a blip that goes off and you have to hit a little clicker each time you see it, and it'll be here, 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 here. That to me even seems inappropriate for an adult because they're testing to see if you don't react in time because you're distracted, right? Or your brain isn't moving fast enough. Well, mine moves pretty quickly. Yeah. So if you gave that to me now, I would be like, click, click, click. I got this, and I'm zoned in and I'm focused. And screens, it is something that the nuance of it is there's so many factors in play. Mm-hmm. I'm going to win. I'm going to win this, which means I don't have ADHD.
According to that
driving.
Assessment.
Yes. According to that assessment, if I had the appropriate reaction time, or I hit my little buzzer in time, I wouldn't have ADHD. And I definitely
You were saying about driving, though. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think another piece that comes into play is when adults are tested in that way, we have a reaction time because we've had the years to experience, okay, I need to be vigilant. I need to look both ways before I cross the street. I drive. Almost every day. Yeah. I am constantly surveilling. Like I have reaction time.
You've learned.
Because I practice it constantly. Yeah. A child hasn't.
Right. Your brain has developed that skill in another space.
Yes. Mm-hmm. People who have children, let's say you don't drive. If you have children, you are constantly watching those children, especially if you have multiple. Yeah. Your reaction time isn't slow.
And that's not always an indicator in adults, is what you're saying.
No, it's not. ADHD. But it is one of the things that they prominently look for with ADHD.
And then we have other types of neurodivergence that can assist ADHD, we can say, or hide it. And you and I have had conversation about this. Giftedness is a type of neurodivergence that really doesn't get talked about enough. We'll do that on another podcast episode. Giftedness doesn't get talked about enough. And so when you put giftedness and ADHD together in the same brain, in the same person, then that working memory, that thing that can process a lot of things very quickly, can mask other parts of ADHD, like the reaction time, for example. Yeah. Yeah. And they'll go, you don't have ADHD. You're smart. What?
Yep. You're smart. You can't have this.
As if, I mean, how insulting too, as if, what does that say to people who have been diagnosed with ADHD? That they're not intelligent, that they're not smart? Like it's bullshit. It really, really, really is. And, we're talking about how in like professional settings, people misdiagnose or underdiagnose ADHD. But going back to how ADHD has become like this pop culture term, we have a lot of folks who are on social media and they are watching different videos and stuff about, you know, what neurodivergence is, what ADHD is, what it's not. What is social media getting right and wrong out there about ADHD? Like, what are some of the things that you're hearing, some of the myths out there?
Some of the, I don't know, myths, because again, like my algorithm, honestly, is probably set up to give me exactly what I'm looking for. But I really actually support social media and the way that people present themselves, whether it's true or not. It gets the conversation going. And it's a huge reason why a lot of people come in going, I saw this TikTok and I really related to it. Great. Have you seen some more? What else did you relate to? It's getting language out there and oh, look, this is it. I don't know how to say it, but this is it. And so I personally have not thought of it as a, you know, oh, well, everyone thinks that they have ADHD now. Everybody thinks that because it's all over social media. No, somebody's just finally putting words to it.
That's been mostly my experience as well. And even with autism, I've seen that where people are like, oh, wait, I thought autism was this other thing altogether that meant that like I couldn't hold down a job and I couldn't, you know, get through college or something like that. They're like, I didn't know that this is what autism was. But I saw this TikTok or I saw this reel and I'm starting to wonder now, you know, and then they end up going down the rabbit hole, likely because they are neurodivergent oftentimes. And there's like a lot that is resonating, which is why they keep watching more reels. And so, yeah, I've seen that. I think some of the myths have actually been some of the things in the past. I mean, the stuff that I'm seeing more recently, it seems to be, I love what you're saying. Like it's getting a conversation going and it's beyond, like it's taking it outside of this feeling that we have within us, that itching that feels like something just feels a little bit different. Like we were talking about initially, but bringing this more to the collective. And so like I personally am thinking that it's, and what I'm hearing from you, it's like helping us start to belong back to each other again, where we're not feeling like the weird kid. And the weird kid could be in a 50-year-old body like mine, you know, where I felt like that literally until a few months ago. And I'm like, I love my weird, you know?
Yeah. And that's it but I like this about me. How can it be something wrong?
Yeah.
What's wrong with me if I like this?
Yeah.
Or like attention deficit disorder, like hyperactivity disorder. I don't have attention deficits. I have hyper focus. I can follow 5 conversations at once and tell you where you are in every one of them. And like you said, like it's this piece that motivates, that gets me going. And it's not, I don't know, it doesn't feel, are there times where I'm like, okay, I am having to push harder. I am working myself to burn out harder. I need to be more cautious of taking my time, making sure I'm eating, all of those things. Yes. But it's still a part that I think has made me who I am and where I am in my life in a great way.
Well, and look at the service that you're providing so many of us, even as therapists too. So my ADHD has gotten me off topic here. So I want to circle back to the assessment that you created. How is it different than the ones that were out there? Like, what did you do differently than the ones that were not capturing an adult experience?
Truly context. So with these assessments, I wanted to make sure that there was as little wiggle room for someone to push back against these as possible. So one, the person being assessed feels fully validated in, look at this. It is comprehensive. I see where I'm meeting these traits. And then a provider, another professional can see it as a very like, okay, you are checking these boxes from the DSM, which is what is required for this diagnosis. So taking those DSM criteria that are required, putting them into researched adult trait terms, and then asking for context. And it sounds, when I say it out loud, I always sound like it's so simple. It truly feels that way.
Well, it is simple. I'm sure it wasn't simple to put together, but it is.
It took about 2 years.
Yeah, it took a minute, right? It's not simple to put together, but I've conducted this assessment for clients. I don't even know how many times now, just in the last few weeks since I've been trained. And one of the things is that, people in the mental health field can push back on this, and that's fine. But the reality is that there's this myth out there that only psychologists or psychiatrists can conduct these assessments. And if you, at least in our state, if you're a licensed clinician and you have the training that you need to do a certain assessment, then you can provide that assessment. And so you and I are counselors, we're licensed counselors, and you conduct these assessments. Many people in our practice now as counselors or social workers are now conducting these assessments, and we've not had any problems with it. School systems have accepted it. I mean,
beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, everybody has to check with their own, school system or workplace or whomever it is, if they're needing like recommendations for accommodations, but we are allowed to do it. So if you're a therapist out there and you don't believe it, at me, that's fine. I'm telling you, it's like, it's legit. We've checked with so many people, this, and it's a legitimate assessment. It's qualitative in nature because it goes through, like you said, every single criteria in the DSM for ADHD and for autism, and even for several other diagnoses that we're doing, to check for, like anxiety, depression, and other things. And it's just asking the question in a different way than the assessments out there. It's still gathering the same information, but the way that you ask it, like you said, there's more context to it. And so we're capturing more of the nuances of someone's lived experiences, where we can actually hear examples and stories that show whether or not it aligns with the criteria for ADHD. And that is unique. It's not just like some self-report, Likert scale where you're given a statement and you say either a yes or no, or you rate yourself from 0 to 5 or whatever it is. It's like actually looking at you as a whole person, which to me makes it, for what I've seen, probably the most valid instrument out there. That it's actually meaning that it's actually capturing and testing, or assessing rather, what it's meant to assess for. It's beautifully done. It really is. So 2 years to create this assessment, Lindley?
2 years till I stopped touching it.
Okay.
Till I was like, it's done. Yes.
Yeah.
2 years till I said, okay. And it was learn experience. You use it and then you realize what you're missing. Yeah. And when you have to go back and ask different, more questions, okay, let me make sure I add this, make sure I ask this in a different way in the future. But yeah, one of my favorite examples to use when I'm training on this assessment is, one of the DSM criteria is you often lose things that are important to you, such as your phone, keys, wallet. That is it. That's the blurb. If you were doing a self-assessment, or I just asked that, and no, I don't often lose my keys. No one's asking you how. How do you not lose them? Yeah. Well, because I just don't. I put them and I remember. Okay. Or, oh no, because you see what happened was I kept losing them to a point where I was late for work so often that I ended up going to Target, getting a key rack, and now they go there. And if they're not there, they're gone, but they go there. And that is how I don't lose them. That is such a different
completely different answer than what you were originally saying. Like, I don't know, I just don't lose them, which would be somebody who maybe doesn't align with that particular criteria. Right. Yes. And then, but someone who does align with the ADHD criteria, but isn't losing their keys. It's like, it's going back to that, like, how are you sitting in the seat? What are you doing to make that happen? Or what's the motivator there, or whatever it is like, oh, this is what I do. And you've mentioned before too, there's so many people with ADHD or ADHDers who are super organized and they're like, I'm the, and you ask the question, like, tell me about your organizational skills. They're like, oh, I'm super organized. It's like, well, tell me what led to your being so organized. And they might say, oh, I've just always been like that since I was a kid. It's just how I am. Right. Or they might say, if I don't have a place for every single thing, I don't know where anything is. And we see this a lot. And I see this a lot with teachers in particularly, because teachers are in a kind of environment where they have to have every single thing in order. And I've seen several teachers in the last few months who have not known that they had ADHD. They just did not know because they thought they were super on top of things, organized, but they would be exhausted. And it wasn't from dealing with 11 children that day. That's part of it. But there are so many other factors of like all the decision making, all the trying to keep up with everything, all the processes that that in that very rigid kind of environment can be pretty tough. And so working with someone to support them on that is another step. So what do you recommend then for folks who suspect that they might have ADHD, but they don't have the means to get an assessment? What kind of things can they do to support themselves?
Well, there are people out there I know that who do low cost. If cost is an issue, who are specifically assessing, hopefully, I know I have an intern who is doing them, who has been personally trained. Your people are doing them. But really it's, if you have the means to go speak to someone, a therapist, even if it is a consultation, like a lot of us will offer free consultations, go out there, find someone who is offering that, who specializes in adult specific ADHD, and just ask. It really can be hey, I am here to ask for help for resources. Send them an email, schedule that consultation, do that 15-minute phone call.
Yeah.
And see what is in your area and in your budget or in your space of here's what I, have to use. Where do I go? What do I do?
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have to have an assessment and diagnosis to get treatment for it. You can say, I feel like I have ADHD. I'd like to get some help. So whatever it is that you're presenting with, right, is what I'm hearing too from you. Whatever it is that's making you think you might have ADHD, you can go get support for that without getting a diagnosis of ADHD. And just be like, I have a hard time remembering things. I'm having a hard time with communication in some of my relationships because I get overwhelmed and I get confused and lost in some of the conversations. Like even if it's that kind of way. And, every university that has graduate programs in social work and marriage and family therapy and counseling, even in psychology, they have to do internship. These graduate students do. We all had to do it. Any of us who are licensed, we had to go through an internship and practicum where we had to work most of the time for free and seeing clients, and glad to do that because that's where we get our training. And there's some excellent interns out there. We have them at Nor Counseling. Lindley has great interns over at CNC Better Work. So here in North Carolina, but if you're in a state that has a graduate program at any of the colleges or universities there, call them and ask them how to get connected with their interns, because likely they're going to have someone who can support you with ADHD and who can do it for low cost or even most of the time free or many times free. Yeah. So that's great advice as far as just like reaching out, Lindley. But then you got me thinking like we can get a hold of interns most of the time. Yeah. And so just reaching out to your universities locally.
And that treatment, counseling, coaching, I call it oftentimes coaching with neurodivergence, because it is the environment. It is the life. It is not do some deep breathing when you can't concentrate. Right. It's not that. Yeah. And so I will oftentimes say, we're going to frame this in a space of, we're going to do some environment coaching. We're going to do how am I going to help put accommodations in for myself? Yeah. I don't need a formal diagnosis to talk through that with you. Right. Absolutely not. When I do trauma work with people, I think I might be neurodivergent. Cool. Let's talk about that a little bit. I'm going to just do more sensory appropriate trauma treatment. Yeah. it can't hurt.
Right.
To assume, let's be more sensory friendly. Okay.
And learning how to advocate for yourself too, around your sensory needs and whatever that might be. And that's such a big part of it is helping people and supporting people to find their own voice and naming what those things are that they need. You don't have to call it ADHD. You really don't. So how do our neurotypical friends out there, what could be helpful for them to know then, Lindley, in supporting folks with ADHD, whether they are presenting with ADHD traits or they have the diagnosis? What could be helpful for them to know in supporting their loved ones, friends, colleagues?
I think the biggest thing is in that support is taking a step back. And this is probably a very biased answer coming from personal experiences, because, just growing up being around people who knew I had ADHD or not, what we experience and how we kind of present ourselves isn't personal.
Yeah.
And I think that support, at least I know for me, one of the biggest supports has been when people are around not taking things personally. Like if I'm overstimulated, and this is typical with ADHD in adults, but I know specifically for me, it looks like anger. And I'm not angry. I'm not raging. I'm overstimulated. I need to go, real quick, and then I'm fine. But it's not personal. And it's, hey, do you need a second? Do you need some space? What you got going on? If you can't tell me, all right, cool, whatever, let's move on. But having that conversation of, I see you, it's cool. Do you need anything?
Yeah. Yeah.
And just that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we really do, I use the word pathologize often, but we can pathologize the people around us. I mean, even as parents, like with our kids with ADHD, thinking like, why can't you just sit still? Why aren't you paying attention?
Why
aren't you keeping on top of your schoolwork? Right. Hey, I've been guilty of this, by the way, not putting together the expectations that I have as a parent, right? Putting that together with like the kid has ADHD. Hello. It's like, this is something that is in their nervous system that's going on. It's like I somehow or another, it's like I, in the past, of course, I'm in a totally different place now, would put this like ADHD kind of thing off to the side and not see it as like central to the person's experience. It's like, wait a second, hang on. Like, it's being, I wish I could have kids at 50 instead of at 30, because you just know so much more, you just know so much more, but physically I couldn't keep up. I could beat myself up for that. But I also would say, like, for parents who have really been struggling with their kids, having grace and even possibly getting your own support that you can. And like, how can I support my neurodivergent or ADHD kid without making them feel worse than they already do? Because that is something that loving parents can inadvertently do, not seeing it as central.
And the same amount of effort and energy that it takes to just go take the laundry out of the dryer. Just do it. Just do it. Why can't you just do it? Why can't you? It's the same as, hey, go grab the laundry you forgot. Hey, don't forget the laundry. Yeah. Laundry, let's walk upstairs. Laundry. Okay.
Right.
Same thing. Tone. Totally different approaches.
The tone, so that we're not perpetuating that shame and our own kind of ableism, really, around it. Like being really ableist. And it's interesting because ADHD parents can have those same frustrations with their ADHD kids, and sometimes, we can understand one another because of that. And sometimes our ADHDs can be in opposition and be clashing with one another. And so, the word that comes to mind as you're explaining that is grace, right? Is grace. And also like seeing ADHD as a central part of someone's identity. Because it's like you said, you're born with it, you're going to die with it. It's not something that you can just leave at home, from 8 to 5 while you're at work, or leave at home from like 5 to 9 when you're at home and your kids are awake. You can't like just hang it on the shelf with those keys and then like pick it back up whenever you want. It's there, so that kind of what I'm hearing too is like embracing ourselves, embracing one another, like just that deep, deep, deep acceptance. And then curiosity to like really see each other and understand what's going on in someone's world a lot more instead of like coming to the assumption that it is something that is wrong with them. Cause like circling back to what you said, it's interesting that the word deficit is one of the D's in ADHD.
Yeah. It's literally in the title.
Yeah. Literally in the title, like there is something wrong with you. And I like how you've said in the past, sadly, there's this really kind of messaging there that you are an inconvenience to the world around you in some way. So the title alone is really pathologizing and doesn't celebrate the gifts that we have.
And I love that you said embrace, because truly it's that. And embracing it, I have seen for a lot of people, if I am not somebody whose brain works well with, okay, I'm going to, do this portion of this assignment and then this portion and then this draft, like you're supposed to do.
Right.
And you work better under a time crunch, just do it. Just do it under your time crunch. It'll save you a lot.
If that's what works for you, then do it that way. Yeah. I mean, but trying to explain that to parents is like, whoa.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
So that's what we're doing here. All right. So Lindley, last question of the hour. What does belonging mean to you?
Belonging to me, I think, means emotional trust with myself and the people I'm around.
That goes deep, deep, deep into that embrace, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. This isn't an excuse.
Yeah.
This isn't a lesser than thing than something else. It's just you.
Just as we are. We're in the cool kids club. That's what I say.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you for being here, Lindley. Love having this conversation. I think it's going to open a lot of people's eyes and also help a lot of people feel seen, embraced, celebrated themselves. So I love you. I appreciate you. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Mona. I love you too. I appreciate everything.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. All of the show notes and links can be found on my website at drmonanour.com. That's drmonanour.com. Throughout most episodes, you'll hear me referring to the belonging model that I developed, which is represented by a belonging life map that helps you explore areas in your life where you feel more connection and areas where you might feel more isolation. And you can get a free copy of your own belonging life map on my website. Again, that's drmonanour.com. If you like the Belonging Reimagined podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review. That can help more folks find us and keep more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mona. You're right where you belong.